From creepy ghosts to tales of enlightenment, January was a month filled with listener stories. I'm always reminded of how vastly unique each and every one of our experiences are when reading your emails. But even though our experiences are different in many ways, there's always something that I can relate to, and I'm sure that most of you feel the same way. And the 7 stories in tonight's show are no exception.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. Before we get started, I want to say a quick thank you to Robin, Cassandra, Julie, Courtney, and our most recent patron, Tiffany, for your continued support on Patreon. You are appreciated more than you know. Tonight's first story comes from Shelby, and Shelby says, "Today was the first time that I heard and binged your podcasts, which was a pleasant experience, until I was listening to episode 35, when I heard Trinity's experience, and I could relate in chilling ways. December 2018, I moved out of my parents' house at 19, with a boyfriend into his apartment. On the weekends, I would get up at 3 a.m. for work at 4:30 a.m. A few months afterwards, in about June or July, I woke up, shut my alarm off, and immediately went into the bathroom. I stood in the mirror, brushing my teeth in dead silence, other than the running water, when my boyfriend jumped in the doorway, which I could see from the mirror, and screamed, 'Boo!' I screamed loudly, and turned around immediately to yell at him for scaring me that way. I apparently didn't scream loud enough, because he was all the way in the bedroom fast asleep still. Nothing happened since then, until last week. We moved into a new apartment, and I was once again in the bathroom after showering. He asked me to hurry up so he could use the bathroom, so I just took my clothes with me into the bedroom and started to get dressed facing the mirror in the bedroom. I didn't tell him that I was out yet and started to get dressed. In the dresser mirror, I could see him walk past me toward the bathroom, shirtless in his gray shorts, with a quick glance at me, which isn't very like him to not find something to say about everything, so I called out his name. With no answer, I went to the bathroom, which was in the direction he was walking, to see him not there. I immediately ran to the other side of the apartment to see him sitting on the couch, confused why I burst into the room. The worst part? He was wearing something completely different. He was in black sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. I've told him about both experiences, and he just laughs them off too easily. Our next story comes from Joetta. Joetta says, "I have often had déjà vu, and even have had dreams that later come to life. I often dreamt that my niece, Hillary, that I grew up with, would pass away. I've dreamed this throughout my childhood. A few months after her 26th birthday, she suddenly passed away. On November 24th, 2019, my sister sent me a picture of a test confirming that she was pregnant. We were ecstatic. She had lost her only child to an accidental drowning a year earlier. Later that night I went to bed and had a very lucid dream. I had dreamt that my sister's pregnancy would end in miscarriage. I woke up devastated. I could not shake the feeling, so I called my mom on the way to work. I told her about the dream, and she assured me that everything would be just fine, and that it would not happen. My sister began to have complications a couple of months later, and lost the pregnancy on January 4th, 2020. I've had many of these prophetic dreams throughout my life, but couldn't explain them, and knew many wouldn't believe. This last time I confided in my mother before it happened, so I could at least have a witness to it. It's good to be able to share my experience with your podcast. Thank you, Joetta. Our next story comes from Jesse. Jesse says, "Hello. When I was about 6 years old, I had my first encounter with him. I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. When I opened the bedroom door, he was standing in the middle of the hallway staring at me with red eyes. I was scared, so I decided to run through him, and that's when he pushed me down the stairs. When I tumbled down, I saw him coming closer, so I ran to my father's room to tell him, but he was recording music and made me leave, so I told my mom, and she didn't believe me. I knew I wasn't sleeping. I knew it wasn't a dream. A couple years later, the house burnt down, but no one was hurt. I saw the Hat Man leaving the house, going towards the woods. I ended up seeing him from afar in the woods that same year. Fast forward to when I was 16, I was watching the TV show, A Haunting. They were talking about shadow people, so I googled an image of a shadow person, and I freaked out to see him as a first result. I have many questions about what this entity is, and if I did the right thing fighting him. I've always been sensitive and been haunted by some spirits that are positive. I hope my story helps." Our next story comes from Richard in Ontario. Richard called his story Enlightenment. Richard says, "This story may not fit with your usual stories read on your podcast, but I believe something mysterious happened. November 2nd, 1979 is a date that changed my life forever. Growing up the youngest of 5, with 3 brothers and 1 sister. 2 of my brothers are 12, 10 years, and my sister is 8 years older. My other brother Jeff was the closest to my age, with just over 3 years. Well, exactly 3 years and 24 days. Being so close in age, Jeff was the only sibling I played and interacted with daily. We had a group of friends all within the same age group on our street. We would do all the things boys do, along with a few we shouldn't. One thing we truly enjoyed was wrestling and play fighting. This was no different on the night of November 2nd. Jeff, along with 2 friends and myself, were wrestling on the front lawn of my parents' house. After about 20 minutes, my brother Jeff sat up and said he needed to rest. He then slumped over and did not move or speak. We thought he was fooling around, so we tickled him and tried to get him to laugh or wake up. After a few seconds, I realized there was something wrong. Jeff was born with a heart defect and had had surgery in early summer, a few years prior. By the end of that summer, he was back to his old self. However, my parents did tell everyone about the possibility that he would continue to have some issues. Once I realized that something was seriously wrong with him, I asked my 2 friends to stay with Jeff, and I would go get my brother and his friends, who were partying in the basement of my parents' house. One of my brother's friends was in university to become a doctor. Entering the front door, I had to pass by the living room where my parents were watching TV. As I crossed the doorway, my mother asked me what was wrong. I did not answer. I proceeded past the living room and down the stairs to the basement. Entering what my brother called the swamp, aka his very large bedroom, my brother Pete almost immediately looked up and said, "There's something wrong with Jeff." After that point, things started to become a dream. I don't know how we got from the basement back outside, but the next memory was seeing my brother's friend trying to resuscitate Jeff. I walked past them and re-entered the front door of the house. The living room was empty. Passing the kitchen, I saw another of Pete's friends yelling on the phone to hurry up. I continued down the hall and past our spare bedroom. There I saw one of my friends staring at our fish tank with a glazed look on his face. My next memory was watching the ambulance start down the street. A few of Pete's friends stayed with me while my parents were at the hospital. At around 11:45 p.m., Pete and my parents returned home. I was cleaning up my room when my mother opened my door with a look on her face I could understand. Jeff was gone. That night my mother held me while she tried to sleep. The next morning, all my friends from our street were in a fort that my brother Jeff had designed, built, and wired for electricity. The fort had a small bar and bench seating along 2 walls. I was sitting behind the bar. No one was saying anything. We were all in shock. At one point, I looked down and saw a light switch lying on the floor. Picking it up, I experienced something I had never felt before or since. A tingle started at the bottom of my spine. and worked its way up to my head. Looking at the switch in my hand, I knew exactly how Jeff did the electrical work in the fort. I had never known anything about electrical. I had no clue how a switch worked, how lights turned on or off, but from that moment, I knew how he did the electrical and designed the fort. I looked at my friends and said, I know how he did it. I know how he did everything. A few days later, my mother approached me and gave me Jeff's bank book. Jeff and I had been saving our paper route money to buy a snowblower to start our own snow removal business that winter. I asked her why I was getting his money. She said, the knowledge and money of a person who dies goes to the person they love the most. I had never told my mother about the light switch incident. This totally freaked me out. I truly believe that this knowledge was passed to me that day. I understand everything about electricity, electronics, design, and how things are built. Over the past 40 years, I have rewired, renovated, and maintained my homes. Last year, I started to build a 1,000 square foot addition to my current home. Thanks for reading. Rich. Our next story comes from Nicole in Kentucky. She calls her experience Ghost. Nicole says, Hello, my name is Nicole. My husband and I rent a small farmhouse in rural Kentucky. Though we've had multiple strange experiences in this house in the 2 years that we've rented it, such as many unexplained noises and feelings, hands on our backs, we had one recently that stood out. We had just finished bringing in groceries into our kitchen, and my husband had to run to a neighbor's house to drop something off. As I was putting things away, I got this horrible feeling, like a feeling of piercing panic taking over me. I tried to brush it off and continue. I then heard heavy footsteps coming toward me, as if they were in the next room. I quickly turned, thinking my husband had returned, but he had not. When I did hear him unlocking the front door, he comes in and immediately hollers, "Are you okay?" I told him yes, and asked why, not yet telling him about my bad feeling. He responded saying he had a really strange feeling and heard strange breathing when he was at the door. We immediately left everything where it was in the kitchen and went to our room, where moments later the feeling was completely gone and has not yet returned. My husband brushed it off, but I'm convinced we are not alone in this house. Our next story comes from Marcia, and she calls it Office Entity. Marcia says, Good afternoon. I wrote to you a few months back about an experience I had when I was a child, and I was surprised when you shared it, but grateful as well. I am still a huge fan of the podcast, and I wanted to share a new experience my coworkers and I have had with an office entity. For the last few months, there's been noises in our office. We are accustomed to noises in the office from our printers or AC, or the computer hums, but these are completely different. On a few different occasions, my coworker that sits in the desk directly behind mine and I have heard faint haze or something dropping, and we look and nothing has fallen. We have heard tapping on our windows, and when we look, no one is there. One of the other ladies has seen someone walk by and has asked a question and realizes no one is in the office with her. It's gotten progressively more active, but nothing harmful. It has made all of us in the office more aware and a bit on edge, but not frightened. We have all had experiences, and there is 5 of us in the office. I know it's strange as the building is fairly new, but even in the archive space in the back of the building, the aura, if we can call it that, changes. It makes us want to get out of there quicker than we normally would in any other office. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. Marcia. Our next story comes from Eduardo. Eduardo says, Hello, Nick. My name is Eduardo, and I've been listening to your podcast on Spotify for about a month now. Ever since the first episode, I've been wanting to write in my experiences from when I was 7 or 8 years old. It's a little long since it kind of takes place over the span of almost 8 years in the first house I lived in the U.S., and the apartment we lived in for a couple years. I also included a story that's about my grandfather who passed away late in 2018. It's not really scary, but I think you'd like to hear what happened to me and my mom. Thank you for your time, and I hope you read this, and it would be an honor if it made it to the podcast. My story starts around when I was 7 or 8. I had just gotten to the U.S. from Central America, and I was starting elementary school. I remember I used to sleep with my door open and the hallway light on. My room was also right across from my parents' room. The way my room was set up, if I laid on my left side, on my bed, I would be able to see my door that led to the hallway, and in my field of view, I could see my digital clock on the nightstand. I don't remember what date it was exactly. I know it must have been a weekday, because I had to wake up for school in the morning. That night I was tossing and turning for most of the night. It was around midnight when I finally got comfortable laying on my left side, and I dozed off to sleep. Then I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was my digital clock on the nightstand. It had 5:45 a.m. on it. I was relieved to see that I had another 30 minutes before I had to get up to get ready for school. So I was just about to close my eyes when I looked toward the hallway and I saw a tall shadow figure just standing in between me and my door. It didn't have a shape, so I couldn't really say it was a man or a woman, or some shape that I would recognize. I jolted from the scare, since I hadn't seen it because I was looking at my clock. I froze, but I didn't really feel threatened or having a feeling that this entity was going to hurt me. Nonetheless, I was terrified, and I laid in my bed frozen from fear, and I didn't blink. I could see my clock out of the corner of my eye. I could see the time passing. 5:55, then 6, then 6:30. It felt like an eternity, but I was unable to move, speak, or even blink. I just stared into where I assume the shadow's eyes would be if it had a face. Then all of a sudden, I managed to blink, and it was gone. Just like that, this huge shadow lingering near my bed just vanished. I was so scared that my first instinct was to get up and tell my parents, since I only had to run across the hall to their room. But I was stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed my clock. To my knowledge, it was 6:30 a.m., and I was late to get up and get ready, and so were my parents, who were usually up at least 10 minutes before I am. I looked at my clock with even more fear when I saw that it was only 5:46. I had sworn I had kept unblinking eye contact with this figure for almost an hour, but when I came to, only a minute had passed. I was the most frightened I had and ever will be at that moment in my life. I didn't sleep the rest of the time, and I just decided to lie awake until my parents got up. I decided not to tell my parents because I didn't think they would believe me, and just say that it was a nightmare, but I know it wasn't a nightmare. I was awake the whole time. That was the first paranormal experience I had, and it was a rude awakening to the many more I was about to have. From that night on, I began to have sleep paralysis episodes almost every day for the next 8 years while we lived in that house. While in sleep paralysis, I would see all of my toys turn to look at me while I was struggling to move or even speak. When I tried to move, it felt like my legs and my arms were being held down, and I had a feeling that something heavy was being on my chest. All I could move was my eyes and my head from side to side, even though it was very slow. When I tried to speak, all that would come out was air, kind of like when you've been screaming and your vocal cords give out, and it's just air moving out of your lungs. After the first few weeks of this, I told my parents, but as expected, they just said that they were nightmares. But I've had nightmares before, and this was on a whole different level. After a month or so of having these sleep paralysis episodes, my mom got me a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which doubled as a nightlight from a light bulb that was at the base of her feet. My mom at this point is very religious, so it started to worry her that I kept having these dreams. So she got me a religious statue to look over me as I slept. It worked for about 2 to 3 days. Then, the sleep paralysis started up again. But this time, whatever was tormenting me started to warp and distort the faces of my toys to look almost demonic, with bright red eyes, horns, and fangs. Even the statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe's face distorted this way. I again didn't feel safe sleeping at night. As this happened more and more, the months turned into years. I started getting used to this. I expected the same thing to happen every night, so there was a point to where I wouldn't fight it. I wouldn't struggle to move or speak. I'd just lay there and just try to go back to sleep. Sometimes when I'd wake up, paralyzed, nothing would be moving to look at me, or faces getting distorted, but I would see this black cloud in the corner of my room, right above my closet. One of my theories now is that the entity would feed off my fear, and so when I stopped reacting to all the imagery that it would give me, this thing decided to step it up to poltergeist. The first instance of this was when I was 12 to 13. For a little background, I was left alone in my house because my parents both worked in the afternoon through the night, and I was alone for most of the day after school until one of my family friends that lived in the same neighborhood would pick me up and take me to her house. My parents didn't want me walking to their house by myself, so I had to wait at home until she was available to pick me up. One day I was home waiting on our family friend to pick me up, and I was in my parents' room watching TV when suddenly I hear guitar strings being strummed. I originally thought that it was the TV, so I muted the TV, but it happened again, and it was coming from my room in the closet. I had a very cheap blue guitar that my parents had bought for me because I was obsessed with guitars for like a week, and I kept it in my closet. A little freaked out, I went into my closet to see what was going on, but there was nothing in my closet, so I returned to my parents' room, and I unmuted the TV, but kept it at a very low volume. Again, I started hearing the guitar strings being pulled one by one, and my first thought was that there was an animal in my closet. So I went back with a broom and started poking around and even emptying my closet of shoes and dirty clothes in my laundry basket, but I found nothing. So I put everything back, and as I closed my closet and was walking back to my parents' room, the guitar started being strummed very fast and extremely loud. It scared me so much, I got out of the house and started running to our family friend's house. After that first poltergeist, if you can even call it that, things around the house started moving. Things were not where we left them, and some things even seemed to look like they were thrown across the room while we were gone. Not long after, my parents divorced. My dad left the house, and me and my mom stayed. Then, a year afterwards, my mom met my now stepdad, and he moved in, and soon after my mom was pregnant with my little sister. For some reasons unknown to me at the time, my mom didn't want my sister to have to live in that house, so we found an apartment down the road. In the new apartment, I felt like I could finally breathe. I still had sleep paralysis episodes, but they were few and far between. But after my sister was born, and we came back to the apartment from the hospital, the apartment felt dark. Where there should have been excitement and happiness because of the newest member of our family, there was a lingering feeling of sorrow. For the first year or so, everything was normal. Then almost out of nowhere, my sister was having these horrible nightmares, where she'd scream for something or someone to let go of her, and she would scream like she was in intense pain. This would happen 2 to 3 times a week, and I didn't know how to protect her from these nightmares, which deep inside of me I knew weren't just bad dreams. My mom thought it had something to do with bad energy that people would leave on her from interactions when she would be outside of the apartment. My stepdad didn't think anything at all. He was never a believer in the supernatural or anything of the sort. I was falling into a depression because I knew that this was like what was happening to me in our old house, where I was tormented by an evil entity, and I couldn't do anything to stop it from terrorizing my sister. Until one day, I figured if I could distract this evil presence to focus on me instead of my sister, then she could be left alone. So one day while I was home alone, I turned off all the lights, and I just went into each room of the apartment. It was only a 2-bedroom, and I sat and tried to communicate with whatever it was in our home. I was sitting on the floor of my parents' closet with my eyes closed, asking this thing to mess with me instead of my sister, when I felt a burning sensation on my back and a loud growl in my left ear. I knew I was in the presence of something evil, and so I asked it to leave my sister alone. If it wanted to torment someone, that it should be me, and if it didn't agree with that, then it should leave our home, where it was not invited. At this point, I have had plenty of experience with these entities, where I wasn't too afraid to confront them, compared to when I was younger, and I just let them bully me. In the closet there was a heavy feeling, and I couldn't breathe properly, but I sat there hoping that I had convinced this evil presence to go for me instead of my sister, and after a while the atmosphere lightened, and I got up and went on with the rest of my day. After that, my sister was able to sleep much better, and she only had those types of hardcore nightmares once or only twice a month. As for me, I didn't have nightmares, but I started seeing more shadows moving out of the corner of my eyes, and more things moving around, and things dropping, even though I know I put them far from any place they could possibly drop. It wasn't bad, not like at our previous house at least. After 3 years of living in that apartment, we were finally able to buy a house, and we since moved. Neither my sister nor I have had any problems with paranormal activity. Whatever those entities were, I'm glad we left them behind. I also have another story, but it's on the brighter side of things. Back in late 2018, my grandfather fell ill, and my mother flew to take care of him until he passed. I remember how hard it hit all of us that he got sick and passed away after having seen him in early 2018 super healthy, even going on bike rides for hours at a time. When he passed, we were all extremely sad. I didn't want to talk to my mother about it because I didn't want her to become sad and start crying. But a couple of days after his passing, we were talking about him and remembering all the good times we had together. During that talk, my mom brought up that sometimes our loved ones have a little time to come by and check on us one last time before they head to heaven. Of course, I agreed with my mom and comforted her, and we both sat on the couch with tears in our eyes. Now, I don't claim to know what happens after death, but my idea was that we die and our soul goes to heaven. No in-between time like my mom had told me. That's what I thought until the day after we had that conversation. I had to go to work that morning, but I hadn't set my alarm the night before, so I was definitely going to oversleep. I was lying in bed asleep when I felt a strong nudge and then a grab on my shoulder. I thought it was my stepdad trying to wake me up, as he is the only one that moves me to wake me up. But when I opened my eyes, I looked around and there was no one, and I didn't hear my door open or close, so no one could have been in my room. Then I saw my clock, and I saw that it was 7:30, which is when my alarm was supposed to wake me up, if I had set it. I was almost immediately sure my grandfather was the one who woke me up. After waking up, I just felt warm and happy, so I know even in the afterlife, he is looking after me. But what really confirmed that it was my grandfather was that night, after working, I told my mom about it, and she told me that she had seen him in a dream, telling her not to be sad, that he will always be with us, looking after us. I believe that he wanted to be in one of my dreams as well, after visiting my mom, but he knew I had to wake up, so he nudged me awake instead. If you use this story on the podcast, I would like to send a message to my grandfather in heaven, or wherever he may be. We miss you so much, and we love you. You will always be in our hearts. Our listener stories have become such a huge part of our podcast, and I want to emphasize how much I appreciate your willingness to share your personal experiences with thousands of others around the world. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of trust. Thank you again to Shelby, Joetta, Jesse, Richard, Nicole, Marcia, and Eduardo for writing in and sharing your stories with us. If you have a story or question for the show, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit paranormal-mysteries.com and click on the Tell Your Story link there. You can also get involved by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're wondering how you can support the show, you're doing it right now just by listening. You can also help by subscribing to the show and sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for other ways to support the show, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries and become a patron there. New episodes are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.